Afternoon from wherever you're joining us today. I'm Rupi Rai, PPP consultant based here in Washington, D.C., and I will be your moderator today for this first webinar in the new series on PPPs in Sub-Saharan Africa. Today's topic is subnational level PPPs in Kenya and their trends, challenges, practices, and implications. This webinar series is hosted jointly by the Open Learning Campus, the PPP Unit Kenya, and the World Bank PPP Group. Now, when we look at subnational PPPs, why are we looking at this topic today? The government of Kenya recently drafted its County PPP Regulations, and this has come as a result of the country's devolution process, which started in 2010 when the new constitution was passed. The County PPP Regulations were drafted really with the goal in mind of achieving greater clarity between the roles of those authorities that are mandated with implementing PPP projects. The objective today is to discuss these county PPP regulations and how they, and also the devolution process, have impacted the implementation of public-private partnerships projects at the subnational level. Hadija Diva is our presenter today. Hadija recently signed on as the County PPP advisor in the PPP unit in Kenya, where she provides support to county governments. She's a certified project finance specialist with the Institute of Public-Private Partnerships, and for the past 4 years, she has been part of the World Bank's Infrastructure Finance and Public-Private Partnerships project as a financial modeler. With Hadija joining us today from Nairobi is one of our discussants, Stefan Kauder. Stefan is a Senior Program Manager, Infrastructure Specialist, and Business Development Executive with over 20 years of experience in international development consulting. Currently, Stefan is a Senior Advisor for PPPs at the World Bank office in Kenya. And he's a member of the same team as Hadija on the World Bank Task Team for Infrastructure Finance and Public-Private Partnerships for Kenya. Jeffrey Delman is a Senior PPP Specialist at the World Bank and is joining us from Dar es Salaam today. In his current role, Jeff has been with the World Bank since 2005, and he has been advising on infrastructure, finance, and public-private partnerships. And prior to joining the World Bank Group, Jeff spent 11 years in Paris and London, advising on infrastructure and PPP projects. Jeff has authored numerous books and also articles on public-private partnerships. I think we have a great round of speaker and discussants today. So just quickly about today's agenda. We will first hear Hadija's presentation for roughly 25 minutes, followed by Stefan and Jeff's comments. And we will then quickly proceed to a Q&A session. So please send us your questions via the chat. We'll be monitoring that closely. And with this introduction, over to Hadija.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Rupi. And before we forget, I'd like to express the PPP unit's gratitude to the OLC team at DC for providing us with this platform for engagement and actually sensitization and awareness creation on country's PPP program. Hello to also our colleague. I think he's not yet connected, but we appreciate the relationship we have with the Tanzanian team with Jeff. I know we don't have much time. 25 minutes is not a lot to finish this topic, so I'll jump straight to it. At the outset, I think it's important to mention that while Kenya promulgated the new constitution in August of 2010, the actual operationalization of the key element within this constitution began in earnest post the March 2013 elections. This is because it introduced the element of devolution, and through this, it devolved two arms of the three arms of government, that is namely the legislature and the executive, to the 47 political and administrative county governments. We emphasize the word political, and we will touch on why that is of importance to the PPP agenda in the country. So while there's a lot of talk in the country about the effect of our county governments, I think there is merit in giving credit where it's due, and in particular to what the county governments have been able to undertake since 2013. There has been a significant progress in the involvement of stakeholders in the development at the county level. There has been creation of employment opportunities at the local level, and more particularly and of importance, and this was behind the whole spirit of constitution, there's more accountability of the political system and the decision making at that county level. So while we'll discuss the objective of this seminar, of this webinar, I apologize, it's towards the trends, challenges, but also we wish to focus on the type of practical approaches that we at the PPP units have adopted towards providing a practical solution to those challenges witnessed. So let's talk about the trends. So we decided to break in this topic of trends to the particular stakeholders. And for the particular subjects, that is the county governments, from the county government's perspective, and also from the PPP regulatory institutions. We can start with these two. We have other two key stakeholders, which we'll look at in the next slide. When the county governments became into 2013, they began the effectualization of the constitution. One key thing, it did not take too long for our county governments to realize, was that number one, there's not enough funding available to them to actually meet the needs of the people on the ground, the electorates who put them in place. And number two, that the whole element of PPPs would require a very systematic and structured way of implementing it. From that perspective, there was that eagerness to try and implement the fourth schedule of the Constitution, which was their mandated distribution of functions. With that eagerness to try and show some sort of progress to their electorate, there was the need of trying to go before the process, trying to achieve targets without necessarily following the process as dictated within the PPP Act. What this then put in place was that the PPP unit's regulatory function kicked in, and we were able to step in and sort of put a pause on what was not necessarily being seen as having followed the PPP Act. With that, there were some projects that went a bit further and got to the element of trying to execute a contract without following the necessary procedures. And in the country, there was witness cases of impeachment attempts for some of our local county officials. Because of those two key things, where there was loss of time and effort in having us step in and put a pause in it, and also some of the impeachment attempts to some of our political public agencies, there was the increased need and caution of trying to understand, okay, so what is the process? What do we need to do? So not only to follow the actual regulatory elements, but also to deliver what we believe the PPP agenda can provide. And through that discussion, they were able to sort of have that more proactive approach to approach the PPP unit and seek guidance in what the PPP Act entails, and sort of ask for support where required. From the PPP regulatory institutions, and here we speak in particular to the PPP committee, the PPP petition committee, and also the cabinet, because all these are form part of the PPP life cycle, being the authorized bodies to provide the necessary approvals. Two key elements from their perspective stood out. Number one was that within the PPP process, it introduced a mandatory step of having to undertake a feasibility study. Now, unfortunately, having to do that would require the engagement of qualified consultants who would provide the guarantee and the comfort that the data having been collected and analyzed and presented in a feasibility study report is of validity, because we wish to sort of attract not only our domestic private sector, but the international private sector. That would require some sort of funding in order to bring in the feasibility study consultants. That was not necessarily available to most of our public agencies, both at the national level and the county government. So the PPP regulatory institutions looked through and said, how can we support our contracting authorities in engaging the right people to carry out the due diligence that is required to enable to develop a product for the market and attract those people who can achieve what we see as the visionary element of the PPP agenda in the country. From that support of trying to see how do we provide this funding element, World Bank has been a strong supporter to the PPP program in the country. And like Rupi mentioned at the beginning, the IFPPP project has been able to lend that support to close to 10 to 12 projects in the country. And that's through the Infrastructure Finance and Public-Private Partnership Fund. Another element that became critical and became clear to the regulatory institutions is that there was the recurring complaint from our contracting authorities, and in particular to the county governments, that the PPP process is not only a bit too long, but also complex from the implementing authorities' perspective. So the PPP manual was what we were able to develop with the support of a consultant, and we are just in the final stages of trying to release that. The draft PPP Project Facilitation Fund is what I mentioned earlier as regards trying to provide that funding solution in regards to a project development fund of where we could hire a consultant to do the due diligence that is required to develop the product to the market. There was also the need from the regulatory institutions to put in more control as regards the fiscal risks. One key thing that is certain in any PPP project is that there will be a fiscal commitment or a contingent liability tied to the obligation that the government has. And because we recognize the challenges that our other countries have faced in implementing PPPs, and in particular Portugal and Greece, where contingent liabilities came calling, for a country which has limited resources, having a PPP project, and currently right now we are very active in the energy sector with our independent power producers, the 10-12 of the IPP space, and this is excluding the feed-in tariff program, is accountable to around 5% of our GDP. Having any of those projects call as regards their contingent liabilities would have a fiscal implication to the country that would sort of not necessarily give us the sustainability that we need to sort of develop the programs that we have within our Vision 2030 agenda. Another key party from a trend perspective that we realize would be good to sort of highlight is our development partners. If we take a look at the fourth schedule of the Constitution, it distributes the functions of the national government and the county government into 35 and 14 respectively. Of those 14 within the county government, you take a critical look at it, they tie to what we call the social fabric of the country. That's the water. They're in charge of provision of water and sanitation services. We talk about county transport. This is the rural roads. We speak about health, provision of health services. We speak about housing, affordable housing in particular. We speak about education at the pre-primary and polytechnic level. Those form what government has as a social contract with its people. It's meant to provide this economic advantage. And because of that focus that county governments have in regards to development of its people, our development partners have found that as a key element of focus. And we'll speak on later as to how that has actually been a practical implementation element for the PPP program in the country. The fourth key partner to this process is the private sector. What we've realized is when the PPP program started in earnest, that was in 2013 following the enactment of the PPP Act, majority of those who came to call in to the PPP unit was from the public sector, understandably, because they are the ones faced with the gap, the infrastructure funding gap, and they are looking at innovative solutions of trying to develop infrastructure and public service provision to its people. But following 2014, 2015, when the PPP program started gaining more momentum and trying to attract the international private sector, those became a huge client to the PPP unit, calling and saying, I wish to sit down and understand your process. I wish to know how can I submit a privately initiated investment proposal. And that's become one of the other big population of documents that the PPP unit receives. And we see that as a positive element because the country's agenda is very pro-private sector. And having them see an investment opportunity and submit it is actually a testament to the message that Kenya is sending out to the international market. But in overall, I'll summarize it as the key trend that we've seen from the PPP unit and in regards to the county PPP program is that there's an increased dialogue from the county governments to our development partners to our private sector and also the civil society. There's that increased dialogue, increased need of understanding what each other's needs are, but more so increased trust, because now there's clarity in the process. There's clarity behind the objectivity of why certain regulatory elements have been put in place. The next key topic that we'll touch on was the challenges. And challenges, we've broken it down into three key elements. From the intergovernmental relations perspective, and we'll speak specifically to this as it does not necessarily touch just on PPPs, but also from the public procurement perspective. As a country that's still in transition following the enactment of the promulgation of the Constitution in 2010 to the actual operationalization of it in 2013, we are still in the process of closing down the loop of full transition. And the transition authority that was put in place, whose tenure came to an end early, just last month, there has been some sort of still pending elements that need to be fully transitioned to the county governments. We have the Intergovernmental Relations Technical Committee having taken over the pending elements from the Transition Authority's mandate. The second element that has become an intergovernmental relations issue is tied to the alignment of some of the existing legislation to the provisions of the new constitution. If we recall our initial discussion on the fact that the fourth schedule of the constitution distributes what the national government can be able to do versus what the county government, there are sectors that were, yes, aligned to national government entities. And here in particular, we speak about the water sector and the road sector. The county governments now having the full authority to take over and provide that to its people, there's still that slow review and slow alignment to it, so as to give full autonomy to the county governments to be able to undertake water projects, both on the public space and the PPP space, but also in the road sector. The road sector is classified right now under national trunk roads and county roads. Those were previously the Class D, E, and other unclassified roads in the country. That legislation is still in discussion, and we hope that soon that can be able to be completed so as to allow the county governments to be able to undertake that full implementation of their obligations. The second challenge that we've witnessed from our perspective as regards implementation of the PPP program stems from the institutional. The thing that our county governments got to inherit once they sort of started implementing their obligations was tied to the fact that they had to absorb the defunct local authorities that were in the previous system of governance. Not only was this a challenge from the perspective that we have a huge wage bill, and I believe from the quoted, the control of budget mentions that 40% of the total revenues is being directed towards the wage bill of our county governments. This, I believe, is in contrast to what the IMF sees as the market standard, which is, I think, 33%. Having absorbed that, was still having to fill in a gap of bringing in new people who would fill in the element of new techniques, new competencies as regards the devolved nature of governance that they have to implement. That meant that they have two sets of staff that they need to work together with, the defunct authorities and the new technical people that they need to bring on board so as to fulfill the function that they have been given. There was also, by bringing in these new people who are more technically competent as regards the implementation of the devolved system of governance, there was disparity in remuneration because those technically competent people would require some level of remuneration as opposed to what is within there in the Salaries and Remuneration Commission system. That obviously would bring some sort of friction as regards the regular day-to-day operation of the county governments. One other key element with regards in particular to PPP is that it being a new and complex process of undertaking public investment, it required people who have already done this before. And from the perspective of trying to know what not to do, that emphasized the need that county governments would not only have the capacity building of PPPs injected within them, but that those staff require the support from a growth element that was not there in the institutions they adopted. I would wish to touch on, stay more in particular to point 3, which is that from the PPP framework perspective. So the thing that has been more clear than anything else as regards the challenges that our county governments face in implementation of the PPP program is that there is lack of clarity as to what is a PPP and what is not a PPP. We have this confusion reigning in when there is a public party trying to engage with a private party, and just from the simplification that this is public and this is private, them coming together was perceived as a PPP, a public-private partnership. But the PPP Act in the country has adopted a very specific definition of what a PPP is, this being a contractual arrangement between a public agency with a private party as regards fulfilling a public function. And within the unit, we call that a public function principle, wherein that private party undertakes to perform that public function on the hopes of getting a compensation, but also the fact that there is the risk element that's tied to it, and they have to be able to take the obligation of should they not perform as per the KPI specified, then there will be some penalty clause tied to it. This confusion would come in as regards JVs, I think, because in the country we not necessarily have a law that governs it. It's governed with a contract law. There's that confusion: is a JV a PPP? Is the MOUs and collaborations with our NGOs a PPP? Or the new thing that we've seen coming out, an EPC plus financing a PPP? So within our capacity building elements, those are some of the key things we're trying to demystify so as to provide clarity and better way forward from their perspective. We also spoke on the capacity of our county governments as regards the institutional size, being that they inherited the local government system and the fact that they need a technical capacity that understands PPP, and that being more on the limited side. The project scale is another issue within county governments as regards their implementation or adoption of the PPP program. The PPP Regulations of 2014 was able to provide a threshold limit as to what can you consider not having to follow through the process that is PPP. It states that on a national government level, anything below 85 million Kenya shillings would not necessarily benefit from the process that is PPP. And on the county government side, anything below 5 million shillings would be considered not viable for the PPP process, based primarily on the fact that the process requires the undertaking of a detailed PPP feasibility study and the engagement of what we refer to as the transaction advisors, who would carry out the due diligence within phase 1 and then support our contracting authorities into phase 2, which is the procurement element. That would, in cases that we've witnessed, not be a low figure as support to compare to a 5 million shillings. So we've had to balance between how much would a transaction advisory expenditure be as opposed to what the actual project is. Another element that is of a key challenge within the PPP framework is that the gatekeeping mandate that our regulatory institutions have. And this is in particular now to the PPP unit, the PPP committee, the petitions committee, and also the cabinet. From a county government perspective, it was perceived that this is still us approaching the national government, seeking approvals from the national government, and we do not have the full autonomy that we have been granted within the Constitution. What we usually sit down with our county governments and try to sensitize on is that Section 33 of the Part 1 of Schedule 4 of the Constitution provides public investment as a national government agenda. And within that, there's the element of fiscal risk. And PPPs will always have a fiscal risk tied to it. And that's why you find that the position of the PPP unit within the National Treasury is of significant importance, because we are able to tie in with our Budget, Fiscal and Economic Affairs Department, but also together with our Public Debt Management Office, because this is the office that will be able to see the fiscal space that the country has. With each PPP project having that inherent characteristic of a fiscal risk, it requires that coordination element from the PPP unit, not only with our national government entities, but also our county governments. From the perspective of the PPP unit, we market ourselves as an intergovernmental agency that is able to maneuver through what the needs of both levels of both levels of government are. From the PPP perspective, and in particular now to the county governments, we've witnessed an influx of privately initiated investment proposals. And that is good, as I mentioned at the beginning, because it shows the comfort that the private sector has in the market that is Kenya. But with some of those PIPs, privately initiated investment proposals, not necessarily would they have adhered to what the non-compete conditions provided in Section 61 of our PPP Act dictate, but necessarily that they would wish to automatically sign off without following the due diligence. That provides a challenge to our county governments, because they are faced with the fact that their electorates have easy access to them and being able to see what progress are you making before we start off with the next set of elections. You promised this, we're not seeing any much action. So the PIP agenda is quite attractive to them. But we support PIP as an agenda, but we just wish for it to follow the process that is dictated within the PPP Act. Another key challenge that the county governments face in particular to this is that, having put it as a mandatory exercise that a feasibility study must be undertaken before actual market engagement on a PPP, there is that automatic response that we do not have enough funding to actually engage the consultants who have financially closed the PPP project. And that's one key criteria that we emphasize on. Let's engage transaction advisors who know the business of PPP, so as to be able to apply the lessons learned from projects they have undertaken and ensure a smoother process as regards market engagement, and contractual inclusion. With this kind of concern from the contracting authorities, and in particular county governments, with the support of World Bank and the Infrastructure Finance and Public-Private Partnership Project, we are looking forward at supporting 2 county projects, and that's within the space of demonstration. We want to show that PPP projects can be done at the county government level. The other key concern that we realize as a challenge to the PPP framework and its implementation is that previously, it would be looked that the challenge of capacity of understanding of PPPs would be concentrated on the public agencies. But having done one of our FAST projects and we got to an engagement with the private sector, the key thing that came out from it that also our domestic private sector may not fully understand the principles behind project finance and PPPs. So the effort that now the PPP unit is looking towards is capacity building of also the private sector, so as to ensure the marriage that needs to happen between the public and the private is of a nature where they understand each other's obligations. And I believe that's what we had on the challenges. Our next key topic was on what are the practices. And practices here, we've adopted the element of what are the approaches that the PPP unit has put in place as regards closing in the gap, as regards fixing the challenges we've seen for the past 3-4 years. The number one thing is that if you look at the PPP pipeline at the moment, the national priority list, it stands at 66. Of those 66, only 7 of those are within the county space. What this showed the PPP unit is that there needs to be more focus. There needs to be more dedicated support to the county governments, because while inherently the national governments were more aggressive as regards adopting the PPP agenda, the need, and this goes back to the social infrastructure objective of our county governments, the need stems more from our county governments. So within the PPP unit, and this is the team that I sit in, we have the County PPP team, of which we're looking at enhancing it further by bringing in 2 more people and be able to spread ourselves to our 47 county governments and engaging them as the needs arises. Another element, and it ties back to the fact that the understanding of the PPP agenda is still limited, both on the public and also on the private sector. We are looking at releasing and rolling out a structured capacity building specific to county PPPs and targeting a number of our county projects on a pilot basis and trying to see how do we do this so that they understand the philosophy behind it so as to be able to make the right decisions in the implementation of it. One other element that ties in also with the capacity building is that the best way to understand the process is to actually do the process, not just sitting in class and trying to understand the process from a theoretical perspective, the practical based approach. And with 2 of the projects that we are looking at supporting within the county space, within the water and solid waste management, we hope that having done the first few ones, we can be able to put in the model concession agreements, give templates, give support to county governments, and be able to adopt the same framework on the first 2 pilot ones that we are rolling out. Within this county team now, we have a deliberate focus on trying to see the key stakeholders and understanding from their perspective what would be the advice that they would give us as regards rolling out of the County PPP program. And we've met with the Council of Governors who were very supportive of the PPP agenda and trying to see, yes, this is the concerns that our county governments have and how can we support them as a team, because from the PPP unit's perspective, we also see ourselves as that intergovernmental agency providing PPP advice to both the national government and the county government. One other key element that has been of a key focus from the PPP unit is that we wish to finalize our list of pre-qualified transaction advisors. From active projects right now, a key concern that has repeatedly been put in place is the support you bring in place to see the PPP process all the way to commercial closure is of extreme key. This is because you want to have someone who understands the intricacies of PPP so as to be able to jump that gap when it comes there, provide that solution, provide that mending element to an information gap. But with some of the county projects that are ongoing, there's not been necessarily that fulfillment of bringing in a party that understands PPP. So by having a pre-qualified list, which we feel will be the competent on a shortlisted basis per sector, and having just informing our county governments, these are the shortlisted 6. All you need to do is release an RFP to them and conclude the engagement process. We see that as providing that extra support that is required so that the PPP process is not only seen as complex, but also cumbersome in its exercise. We speak also on the finalization of our draft PPP manual, and that within that same manual, we will have specific tools as templates that support the standardization and implementation of it. Because once a process becomes standardized, the implementation of it becomes much easier. As now specific to the county regulations. What the PPP unit is doing in the moment, and I just put a pause on the finalization of the county regulations, is that we see some of the concerns that our county governments have stemming from the Parent Act, and that's the PPP Act of 2013. There are elements that during the development of this legal framework, which was gazetted in February of 2013, and the actual operationalization of our county governments in March of 2013, is that in as far as the PPP Act tried to encompass the element of devolution, it did not necessarily capture it in its full entirety. And this is specific to the institutional framework that is adopted within the county government. If you look at the PPP node, the composition of it, the composition of the project appraisal team, the pre-qualification committee, the negotiation committee, that ties reading it in more depth, has adopted the element of national government institutions in its composition. There are certain elements that the Constitution has put in place on what a county government framework, institutional framework looks like. And with the County Governments Act of 2012, we've had engagements with the county governments when we're trying to roll out the PPP county regulations. And one of the key comments came out was, how does this fit in with the institutional framework that we have? And we are trying to amend that Parent Act to provide that wider breadth of county governments and their unique institutional framework that they are working under. Another element that we see as being the recurring theme from comments we've received from the county governments is that the process is sort of tied in with too many approval levels. While we defend that in each element of that approval mechanism, there's an objectivity behind it. There's the need for protection of the fiscal sustainability of the country that imposes that regulatory element from the institutions that have the PPP committee and the petition committee. What we're trying to do is trying to ease some of that regulatory element while still providing fiscal comfort to national treasury. On the next slide, we would speak on the fact that what do we see as implications of the county PPP program in the country? So we are yet to have a fully active program because we have 7 of them and they're still within the project development phase. The farthest we have is at procurement right now, and we are looking closely at that one so as to be able to give an example, a case study on what not to do and what to do in regards to the implementation of the program. What we want to touch on this slide is where do we see it from our visionary element, and this ties into what the PPP policy of 2011 says. The statement hopes that by adopting the PPP theme and adopting the PPP agenda in the country is we will have a more operational efficiency being imposed on the public service delivery, because that's always been the challenge within the public delivery mechanisms of it, is that the efficiency of that delivery and the sustainability of protecting the investment that was developed in the maintenance and management of it has always been lacking. With the PPP agenda, because you are tying the private sector, their payment is tied to the fact that they meet their KPIs. We see that as providing that extra support, an extra solution of a sustainable nature of public service delivery. PPP is also from the county government perspective, and in particular to the fact that we have a huge infrastructure funding gap. We see PPPs as yes being a solution of filling in the gap, but furthermore going beyond that. While that was one of the catalyst effects of why Kenya adopted PPPs, that is just at the frontier level. We see the operational efficiency, the sharing of risks, the timeliness in delivery, the quality in delivery as being the actual value for money for why county governments would be looking towards PPP. From the institutional perspective of county governments, because it imposes a very rigorous nature in the upfront due diligence, we see discipline from the county governments maturing in the fact that they become more competent on what public investment requires, and it requires that private sector thinking on what if this goes wrong, what if does not happen, how do we provide a mitigation measure to it. We hope that by engaging on the PPP philosophy, the scaling up of our county public service using the same rigor of public investment decisions. So in conclusion, and we quickly went through this so as to provide more time for the questions and answers. There was a quote that we read that says that it is a fact now that the devolution train has already left the station. The objective now is to make sure it arrives to the right destination safely and on time. From our perspective at the National Treasury, we see PPPs as a key supporting tool to this agenda. Thank you very much, Rupi.
Thank you, Adija. Very interesting. Good overview of the topic. I would like to go to right away to Stefan and his remarks on this topic. Stefan?
Challenge, as Hadija has explained, here in Kenya to get the county PPP agenda going and to actually implement projects is a capacity problem. So, and I think this is a very interesting topic for this webinar, because I believe there are many countries that are trying to come to grips with this issue, trying to find an efficient way how they can support local government in implementing PPP projects. And Kenya, you heard, Kenya has 47 counties. They have all been newly formed. There are capacity issues in many other areas, not only PPP, and PPPs are complicated procurement models. And on top of that, many of these 47 counties are very, very small. So that's the situation that we're facing here. And I think Kenya has adopted a very clever approach to this, which could be a model for other countries. Kenya has, as Hadija explained, a very robust, well-developed regulatory framework for PPPs at national level, which has a number of checks and balances, which ties to the national budget, and for at each step along the way, monitoring fiscal commitments, contingent liabilities, which tests the value for money of projects, looks at the risk allocation of projects, whether that is a favorable approach, and also certainly looks at the affordability of the project, both for the government but also for the end users. So this kind of technical capacity is now there at national government, and the idea is to slowly bring in the county governments and making some of that expertise available, but at the same time allowing the county governments to develop their own PPP agenda, their own pipelines of project, implement these projects with the support of the national government. So the Project Facilitation Fund, for instance, which is now being established, it's not yet there, will provide the funding to counties, among others. There are other contracting authorities, certainly, and it's maybe worth mentioning there's a bit of competition between contracting authorities, and counties will have to bring good projects forward. But counties can benefit from these funding to hire transaction advisors. The models, the toolkits, the PPP manual, the checklists, the templates, all this is there. And this is a way of getting this county PPP program, if you wish, going. So without having to establish PPP units at county level, which was, I mean, Kenya is not that a rich country. Other countries have gone down that road. But I think the way how I've seen this now over the last 2.5 years or so, Kenya has been very, very clever in learning from other countries. For instance, Canada, which has a similar funding mechanism. But being a rich country, has developed in 4 states of the 13. They have bigger states, certainly, like than we have here, the counties, have established their own PPP units. Those countries who can afford that, fine. But here in Kenya, it is the challenge is to come up with an approach that works and gets us to the good quality results that we require. So much from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefan. We'll proceed with Jeff's remarks and then open up for questions. We've been receiving a lot of them. So let's have Jeff's comments first. Pardon.
Just first of all, the dynamic between local government and central government PPP, which is fascinating. Watching places like India, like Canada, like Australia, where PPP comes from the states, and US, where the states are the ones that drive PPP. Central government comes in to help monitor and maintain and coordinate and get some consistency, but also to make sure that you don't create any massive time bombs that are going to go off. Whereas places like the UK, Kenya, Tanzania, South Africa, we start from the central government and then reach out to local government. And that dynamic changes completely the relationship between the two. And obviously there's a little bit of, there's a frustration at local government level. You've got these big wigs from the central government coming in to tell us what to do. And there's that relationship dynamic that really has to be built out. And it's fascinating watching the PPP unit in Kenya bridging the dynamic between the two. And in the Constitution, we not only created these counties, but there was a lot of devolution involved, and devolution of power and of finances. So there's all that stress between county and central government, in addition to the whole PPP agenda and trying to reach out with the PPP agenda. So fascinating watching how that relationship develops. Carlos asked a question about finance. That's another big challenge. These are smaller projects. They're probably not going to be as attractive for international financiers. So we're talking about local banks, local finance. That's great for foreign exchange risk. More challenging for the cost of debt, which in places like Africa are much higher for local debt, but also the experience of local banks in providing finance to PPP. Really tough dynamic. Also, the counties, the local government, may not have the reputation of ability to pay. So your perception of credit risk of counties is going to be very different. And so those projects and also those counties accessing central government guarantees is going to be more difficult, because those that capacity for guarantee is going to be taken up by the big central government projects. So counties, you have to work even more to make those projects commercially attractive, to make them more commercially robust, to focus on revenues rather than money from the state, money from the project, and how do we leverage that money. But these are incredibly important projects. They are close to the people. They are pro-poor. They are very local. They're very focused on local requirements, local needs, local interests. So the desire to get this local PPP is enormous. And great to see such strides in Kenya, and Hadija and team, fantastic work. Hopefully we will all learn lots more from your successes. Thank you.
Yes, we start with a few of the questions that we have been receiving. Actually, one of them pertains directly to a point that Hadija and Stefan both made. Hadija, you mentioned that you see a trend for increased dialogue and increased trust between different key stakeholders, and which ultimately leads to more clarity and objectivity. And also Stefan briefly touched on capacity issues and models on how to tackle those. One of our users sent us a question in advance. Sadiq Bashir Ibrahim asked, how do we address the issue of capacities at the subnational level that will create more confidence in the mind of private parties and financiers? Stefan, Nadija, over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ruby. The issue of capacity and capacity building is actually one of the key functions of the PPP unit, being put in place as the expertise behind PPP and being on the ground to be able to engage only with the national government entities, but now in particular to the county governments. One key thing that we do, we have an open door policy where each contracting authority that is interested in understanding or trying to enter into a PPP space can be able to come in and sit down with us, and we take throughout the PPP process. Secondly, with the previously back in 2013, we engaged a consultancy firm to undertake a structured learning on PPPs, and for the past 8 months, that has been an ongoing exercise for which we sit down our contracting authorities for 3 days out of Nairobi so that they can have full concentration on the subject that is PPPs, and being able to undertake a modular cumulative capacity growth on the PPP lifecycle, because it starts from project in conceptualization, project identification, project selection, project screening, and then going into now the due diligence that is required for PPP capacity, for PPP project, and into procurement, which tends to be a bit more complicated as opposed to the first 2 steps, and then going into negotiations with the private sector. Having this structured learning and putting a practical face behind it and using case studies from not only our rich IPP experience, but also the RVR, which we know is one of the projects that we have within the country, but also looking further into our neighboring countries within sub-Saharan Africa, looking at South Africa, what they have done, looking at Egypt, and looking further towards the British and the PFI system, trying to put in each element of what can go wrong, because from our perspective, we believe, yes, in looking at successes, but we put more focus on what went wrong on a particular project, because lessons are best learned from knowing what not to do.
Just to add on that, a simple approach is just to make it simple. I mean, we're trying to help the government in developing the tools that county governments can use, and you know, that they don't have to consult the law necessarily in order to do a transaction, or the regulations, but there's a PPP manual which takes us to the various steps, and we provide on top of that the transaction advisors. So it's this, and then as Aditya has mentioned, certainly there's the idea, once we have 1-2 successful projects, there will be exchange of lessons learned. So we just need to get the ball rolling, and we need to simplify these truly very, very complicated issues.
Thank you, Stefan and Aditya. Excellent point. Simplifying processes. Jeff, we have a question for you here. Since you briefly mentioned countries with a lot of experience with similar county PPP programs, Nico Saporiti asks, could you give us any best practice examples of municipal PPP programs? Which countries have done it really well, and how can we learn from them?
Best practice, and especially in the county local government level. The challenge is the nature of the structure. So obviously you've got places like Canada and Australia and India, and places where the PPP is developed up from the county level. And there you've got some really good practices on how those relationships work, how to prioritize those projects. India, for example, has some really good stuff, and most of it's on the internet if you're willing to look for it. But there's some really great learning on how to develop consistency in projects, great new ideas on what to do at county level, the kind of projects that you develop, how to leverage revenues from different directions. Their national project program is very different, the roads program and the power program. But I think, and Mexico has some fantastic examples. You can get bits and pieces from all over the world. I don't know there's any country that is a slam dunk on local government PPP. except Kenya, of course, Kenya being our rising star.
Thank you, Jeff. We have questions here pertaining to risk. Hadija and Stefan. Leonardina Rizza, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, asks, would you please explain how risk transfer to private parties benefits the public and how this can play out in the context of county PPPs? And also Oshani Pereira asks, can the speaker please revisit how fiscal risks are addressed? What measures are in place in Kenya across the PPP unit and the Ministry of Finance?
Good. Hadija will talk about FCCL, about fiscal commitment, contingent liability. She's very much familiar with that. The risk transfer. Basically, a PPP doesn't make sense if significant risks associated to the delivery of the project cannot be transferred to the private sector, and that's why some projects are simply not suitable for PPP, because the private sector perceives them as being too risky, and they will factor that into their proposal, and that will then, and then we come to that point where actually, and Kenya has a really remarkable and state-of-the-art framework for that, to assess whether risks have been allocated adequately. Now, I don't want to go into the models for that particular issue, and which is beyond the actual fiscal risk and contingent liability issues. But basically, you compare the costs, the transaction advisors. There's a financial model, a PPP model that will be compared to a public sector model, and if it's being found that the public sector model would be financially and maybe also from other aspects be more favorable, then it cannot carry on as a PPP, and the process stops. And it's very, very important to have such a clear and if you want, rigid framework for PPPs. And again, Kenya has a very good one. Because otherwise you end up with a very, very messy process.
Okay. I'll quickly jump onto the fiscal risk, but before I do that, I'll like to just add on what Stefana said as regards the question that Leonida has. Would you please explain how transfer of risk to the private parties benefits the public sector? So from a PPP perspective, you're engaging the private party to provide you with a holistic solution, from the financing element to the design, to the construction, and to the operations and maintenance. By according the private party this key obligations, inherently the risk that arise from them would lie with the private sector. Looking at the financing risk, looking at the
Can hear you, Hadija?
Okay, sorry about that, Rupi. We seem to have lost something. We're not sure what, but we've lost something. We apologize.
No problem. Continue, please.
Okay, so I think we were discussing the question of transfer risk and how is it of benefit to the public agency. And I was speaking on the fact that by bringing in a private party to provide a holistic solution to the element of public service delivery, by having them undertaking the financing obligation, the development of the project and the operation and maintenance of it, the risk that would materialize from this obligation would naturally, and this I use the word naturally very lightly because each project is very specific as regards its risk allocation. But that's the beauty of it. By bringing them on board to perform this function, we hope that the risks that they take on board as performing that function, and in particular to the operations and maintenance of the project, would be within their purview. Now, the second question was, sorry, Rupi, could you read it for me on the fiscal risk?
Yes, just a second. The second question on fiscal risk was, could you please revisit how fiscal risks are addressed? What measures are in place in Kenya across the PPP unit and the Ministry of Finance?
Okay, great. So the fiscal risk, the PPP unit with the support of the World Bank developed a fiscal commitment and contingent liabilities management framework so as to be able to provide a risk management element to the subject that is PPP, from the risk identification to the risk allocation and also to the risk valuing and providing a mitigation measure to it. Fiscal risk in particular, from a fiscal commitment and a contingent liability perspective, we have been able to institutionalize it within the National Treasury and in particular the Public Debt Management Office. We put in a fiscal commitment and a contingent liability unit. Within the PPP life cycle, we have that fiscal risk review or evaluation kicking in at feasibility study stage. And I saw one of the questions coming in and it ties to the affordability element. Is this project from a fiscal commitment and contingent liability perspective, is it affordable to government? And we start asking of that question at feasibility study stage, where we seek for an estimation of what that fiscal risk is from that feasibility study. If we are proposing either an availability type based project or a project that will look towards the end user as a source of revenue, would this project be affordable to that end user? And or will the project, and looking at the quantum that is required as either the subsidy or a viability gap fund, be affordable to GOK, Government of Kenya, in the long-term perspective? That fiscal risk evaluation starts that early, from the estimation, from what we believe the project structure would look like once we engage the market. But that, we emphasize, is still very theoretical at that level, from the feasibility study stage. What the fiscal commitment and contingent liability framework suggests, once we've engaged the market and we undertake the procurement phase, and we conclude the two-stage procurement of releasing an RFQ and then going to doing the technical and financial proposal evaluation, what happens after that is that the negotiation with the selected bidder starts. The negotiation with that selected bidder would provide an output that says, I am willing to take this risk, government, you take this risk. I'm willing to take this risk to this extent, and that's when now the fiscal risk that was estimated at feasibility study stage becomes actual. From the feasibility, yes, we accept that's a theoretical element. But post that, there's this figure that now the private sector is saying, I am willing to take this risk. What happens with the FCCL unit at the Public Debt Management Office is there is that now variance analysis versus what we had assumed would be the project structure at feasibility study stage, and the actual project structure being almost signed on by the government. That decision is now being taken critically, and the report from this Public Debt Management Office in the Fiscal Commitment and Contingent Liability Unit is then tabled to the approving body, that is PPP Committee. The PPP Committee would critically look at this while having the input of also the budget, fiscal, and contingent liabilities. Okay, Rupi, I seem to be having an echo.
Yes. Okay. This is better.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's better. So yes, it's a very structured framework. Risk and determine from a long-term perspective, from a 20-30-year perspective, would this obligation that government wants to take on board on the PPP project be sustainable? Is it affordable to us? And that's the decision, one of the key decisions that the committee will sign off before actual project execution by the contracting authority and the private party.
Thank you, Hadija. We unfortunately have technical difficulties connecting back to Dar es Salaam, so we'll address two more questions to Hadija and Stefan, okay, and then we will close this webinar. I will repeat once again the question that Dongjin Kim asked about unsolicited proposals, challenges that you would experience with them, if you can talk about the takeaways there. And another question that came in for you, Hadija, by Tweety Uzele, is you mentioned the intention to launch a PPP county pilot. What counties and sectors will be featured in this pilot? Could you also talk about the county selection criteria, perhaps?
Okay. On the privately initiated investment proposals and the framework that the PPP Act has adopted around managing the unsolicited proposals is that, first and foremost, the PPP Act provides a very strong argument to the principles of the Constitution as regard procurement, having it free, open, fair, and in a competitive market. But having said that, Kenya is very pro-private sector and has provided an avenue for which private sector can bring in innovative ideas, can bring in solutions that maybe from our perspective as a government we have not seen it. See that niche from the outsider's perspective and say, here I have a solution for you. But providing that also there needs to be governance around that, because everyone will come in with their idea and wish to be given that authority or that right to sign off on a contract without having entering into a competition. The PPP Act regulates this by providing it as an exception to the rule. And by being an exception to the rule, privately initiated investment proposals have non-compete conditions that they must meet. 4 of them, for which A would be that there's an urgency in need of the continuity of a particular public service function that had some disruption to it. Second being that you are the only private party that has international monopoly to this. You're the only one that can be able to deliver this public function based on the scope, the complexity, the sort of solution you're bringing. You're the only private party that can do this. That is international monopoly. The third non-compete condition is that you have intellectual property tied to the design of that project. Intellectual properties naturally would lie best with the technology sector, and we've seen some proposals coming in based on that philosophy. And we have the 4th clause that talks about any other condition that the Cabinet Secretary and National Treasury might prescribe. And we understand that there are some vagueness around that, and we are working together with the legal department on seeing how we can be able to actually put it into practice. So from a privately initiated investment proposal perspective, while they are allowed, it's also quite regulated. And it also has elements tied to it that demand whoever submitting a privately initiated investment proposal, that proposal should be detailed enough so as to support the government in answering, is there value for money for this privately initiated proposal? 2, is there affordability to the government and to the end user tied to this? And also, is there optimality in the risk allocation framework that has been proposed within that privately initiated investment proposal? So while it might look like a very direct and easier to implement solution, it's also quite regulated while enshrining the principles that the PPP Act tries to put in place. So on the second question, Rupi, if I may, a question came in on the fact that what are the county pilots that the county team is looking at? So presently, we are supporting the Murang'a County as regards their water supply project, and also Nakuru County in their implementation of the Integrated Solid Waste Management Project. These are just 2 of many others that we wish to engage with, but a prerequisite to that is that a project proposal of a pre-feasibility standard should have already been approved by the PPP committee, because we have a challenge of a limited pipeline from the county government, 7 of them, and 5 of those 7 have already begun the process and are either in the feasibility study stage or procurement. We are looking right now at doing the footwork and engaging our counties and trying to generate that pipeline so that we can be able to support them in undertaking that detailed feasibility and rigorous exercise before actual market engagement. So one of the key criteria is that let's have proposals that have met the threshold of an approval by the PPP committee for step 1.
Thank you, Hadija.
Thank you, Rupi.
Thanks very much. Also to Stefan and Jeff, who we unfortunately couldn't reconnect to. Thank you for this very informative discussion, and also to everyone who sent in questions prior to this webinar and also during the webinar via chat. We have all your email addresses and the questions, and we'll try to follow up with each and every one with you. Thank you for joining this first webinar in this new series on PPPs in Sub-Saharan Africa. And also apologies once again for the technical difficulties. The recording of this webinar will be available 24 hours from now on the Open Learning Campus website. And please fill out the feedback form if you would like to give us recommendations, input on how we can make these webinars even better. The next PPP Group's webinar will be on May 31st on the use of Islamic debt in social sector projects, and we hope you can join. Thank you.
Thank you very much.